welcome to another 10-12 overtime. This is the opportunity for me to do something a little bit different, kind of dive into something a little bit more with some guests that we love to have here on the show. Joining us for his second appearance here on the 10-12 is our good friend Justin Leo of Volume Pigs. Justin, welcome back, man.
Hey man, yeah, it's good to be back. Glad to get the invite back and happy to discuss some Big 12 running backs today.
That is what we're going to talk about today. Of course, you joined us before the season to talk about Big 12 running backs. As we've mentioned so many times, this is the year of the running back in the Big 12. It is a loaded conference of quality running backs. Just before we dive in, we're gonna rank the top five for each of us at this point in the season. What are your overall thoughts on the year of the running back in the Big 12? Has it kind of lived up to that title to you?
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, I think there's quite a few really good running backs. There's been a few surprises, right? I mean, I didn't expect in the preseason that every single running back that we were intrigued by was going to hit, right? Some were going to overperform, some were going to underperform. You can look at a few names, Abu Sama for Iowa State. He's one who's been disappointing, right? You can look around sort of the conference. With some guys, it's not really been their fault. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about that later on. A guy like LJ Martin, for example, where if you look at the aggregate stats right now, his name isn't up there, but he's only played 3 games, right? So he's been out injured. So there's been some surprises in both directions, I would say. But I'd say at that top, and again, I know we're going to talk about this more in a second, but a lot of those guys who are at the top right now are guys we talked about in that show in the summer. So I think it's lived up to my expectations. How about you?
Yeah, I think so. Again, like you mentioned, we've got guys we had high expectations for, like Ollie Gordon, who have disappointed. We've had LJ Martin's been injured, so we haven't had as much from him as we had hoped. And then we've had surprises. Cam Scatabo. I mean, that's a guy we kind of talked about, but didn't really dive into, and he has been, I think, the biggest surprise of the Big 12 so far when it comes to running backs. So, and then there's the names of course, we're going to talk about: DJ Giddens, Taj Brooks, RJ Harvey, Devin Neal, I'm sure. So let's just dive in. We're going to rank them now 5-1, each of us, kind of how we feel things are going. So Justin, I'll start with you then. At this point, who do you think is the fifth best running back in the Big 12 at this point in the season?
Yeah, well, I mean, fifth best. There's so the top four for me. I think I was fairly sort of clear on. The last name was a difficult one, and it's sort of depends on how we want to answer the question. I mean, I still think Ollie Gordon's one of the best running backs in the Big 12, and he showed sort of why that is versus BYU last Friday. I mean, hurdling guys, scored 3 times, but overall in the season he's been disappointing. If we're looking just at sort of production and judging in this year alone, it's harder to argue for Ollie Gordon. Although in my gut, if you ask me, gun to my head, top five running back talents in the Big 12, I feel like Ollie Gordon's still there. But if I'm just going to look at this year in a vacuum, it is a little harder to justify him. I could sort of be a little bit more forward looking here and say, well, even though he's been out, I think LJ Martin is a really talented running back, but he's only played 3 games. I think he's going to have a massive second half of the season. But again, your question is to this point, right? So that kind of leaves me with 2 names that I'm looking at that spot. And the names are Devin Neal for Kansas, and the other name is Micah Bernard for Utah. So neither of these guys are huge surprises. I think we knew Devin Neal ahead of time. With Utah, we're looking at sort of Micah Bernard. He's been there for a while. Wasn't really sure if they were going to have one sort of bell cow or committee. He's kind of taken over in the last couple of weeks. Um, I think though, if I'm going to choose number 5, I'm going to roll with Devin Neal. Even though production-wise, he might be a little bit behind Mark Bernard there, as you're showing on the screen. But in terms of just sort of overall his level of talent, I know Kansas, their sort of season hasn't exactly gone how they've planned so far. New offensive coordinator this year, that tends to sort of bring a little bit of static. But, still a big fan of Devin Neal. Like I said, there's a few different ways I could look at this fifth spot in terms of whether it's production or talent. But I think for this specific question, I think I would choose Devin Neal.
I think that's a great option there. Look, you can't blame him for Kansas's offensive woes. He's not the guy who's been throwing interceptions. He's not the reason that they're blowing leads in the fourth quarter. He's not the offensive coordinator, but he's been effective and one of the most effective running backs. Obviously, you mentioned Micah Bernard. He's got a better yards per carry average, but significantly fewer, 5 fewer touchdowns than Devin Neal. Attempts are about the same. Yards goes to Micah Bernard. So at that point, you can have the argument of it's a little bit of a preference which way you want to lean between those two. Um, I I have Micah Bernard as my number five because like he has been. We talk about the offensive woes for Utah. He's still been able to be impressive in those stretches, anyways. Like you look at it and say, well, Utah's offense is terrible except for Micah Bernard. Like he's the one bright spot for this offense, despite the quarterback struggles. Obviously, Cam Rising being hurt. I think he has been more impressive than I expected from him. Because coming into the year, I looked at the Utah offense and said it's Cam Rising and we'll talk about the potential pass catchers, Brent Keithy at tight end, but we didn't really do much with the running backs. We just didn't have any question there. I think Micah Bernard. There's a lot of guys who are silently really good in the Big 12 that are not getting the headlines, be it because of the team's not playing well, other people are out shadowing them. I think Michael Bernard's been quietly one of the better running backs in the Big 12 that we didn't talk about as much coming into the season, and we're definitely not talking about as much now. So, look, I get it. I get the argument between him and Devin Neal. Which stat you want to preference can help
Yeah.
determine those things. And I don't have PFF stats to pull up all the different things. I just like Micah Micah Bernard has continued to thrive despite an offense that has their offensive coordinator just stepped down. So I will put him in the fifth spot here as opposed to Devin Neal for you. Okay, so that's number five. Number four, who do you have?
Yeah, so number four. So as I said with the last question, the four names in my top four, there wasn't much debate. Where they sort of ranked, I kind of, had to think about a little bit. And really, I think I'm splitting hairs here for some of them. But for number four, I'm gonna roll with Kansas State's DJ Giddens. So I'm a big fan of DJ Giddens. I think he's an incredible running back. His dad is actually a subscriber to my newsletter, which is always
Oh,
appreciated. And of course, I'm keeping it objective here when I put his son in my top five. But no, I think you look at the stats, look at what DJ has done this year. I think anybody, if you ask this question, he's going to be in their top five. He's been fantastic for Kansas State. He's a great runner. He's a great pass catcher. He has the stats to back it up. He is top five in rushing right now in the Big 12. He's a guy that we did talk about in the offseason. He's not a surprise. This was an expectation. He had some big games last year. The thing that was kind of holding him back was Trayshawn Ward was also there in that backfield, and they were sort of splitting touches. Trayshawn Ward, of course, transferred out this offseason. That sort of signaled to everybody else that, DJ Giddens, this is going to be his time. He's going to be the primary bell cow in that offense. And that's exactly what has happened, right? And that Kansas State team, Avery Johnson, this is his first year starting. He's a great runner himself, and he's been sort of stealing some of the rushing success also. But he's not a great passer yet. So this is a team that has really had to rely on the run, and DJ Giddens is sort of the engine of that offense. Fantastic player. He's had a great start to the year, a great first half of the year, I should say. So for me, he's a no-brainer in the top five. It's just a question of sort of where do you rank him. Um, and I'm splitting hairs here, but you have to choose somebody at number four. He's my guy.
I'm not shocked he's in your top five. He is in mine. I've got him a little bit higher just based off of what he has been able to do this season. At number four, I have RJ Harvey. Look, he has been good like we expected him to be this season, but it's hard to argue for him higher when the offense as a whole has struggled. And again, this is an offense that, yeah, they're on quarterback like number three now. Obviously, they've had quarterback struggles. This team was built around the rushing attack, and RJ Harvey is the primary of that. I mean, he leads the Big 12 in yards per game. He has the longest run of anybody in the conference at 80 yards. He leads the all running backs with 11 touchdowns. He has been really good despite the offensive struggles. But I just feel like for a team built around its rushing attack, I wanted a little bit more from him. And that's it's ridiculous to say like he is the leader in all these different stats in the Big 12. How are you asking for more? I kind of am like, right? Like he's been great, but when you're on a team built around a rushing attack, and I know your quarterback has struggled, but he's still so good. Like he's still such a good back, and he's so dynamic, and he's so fun to watch. So I have RJ Harvey at number 4.
Yeah, well, spoiler alert, he's also in my top five, though I have him a little higher.
Okay,
So I guess I'll just roll into my number three pick here.
go for it.
So number three is my boy Taj Brooks. I have quite a few shares of his in my college fantasy leagues, teams, however you want to call that. Love his consistency. He's just so stable. You just know what you're going to get with him. They give him so many carries every week that it's almost impossible for him to not get the yardage and touchdowns because he's just touching the football so much. But there's a reason why the staff have designated him as a guy that they want to get the ball 20 plus times a game. They say this explicitly out loud, so it's not even a surprise, right? They're not trying to hide it. They want Brooks to touch the ball a lot every game. And the reason is they've obviously identified him as a very, very good player. He's very stable, very rarely turns the football over, almost always gets positive yardage, gets hard yards. He's not like a super explosive back. He's a little different than some of these other Big 12 running backs that he's not going to blow the game open. But he's just such a consistent player where if you just keep giving him 20, 25 carries per game, you're going to look up at the scoreboard at the end and it's going to be, he's going to have 100 yards and a couple scores. Again, Texas Tech is another one where, yeah, I know their season maybe has not gone exactly as planned, but Brooks has been a really sort of stable piece in that offense. This is going on 2 years now, and he's a very durable player. I know he dealt with a little bit of injury, some injury situation to start the year. Missed I think one game total, but you consider how many touches he's been getting for the last 2 years. The fact that he's been as available as he has been, it's quite remarkable. And I think it's Bill Belichick who had this quote: "The best ability is availability." And that sort of it really tracks when you look at a player who's getting huge usage the way he has. So I love his consistency. I love how stable he is. He's just Mr. Consistency. So he'd be my pick at number three.
We agree at number 3 at Taj Brooks.
Oh,
Look, it's hard to argue putting him higher. And I know it's nitpicking between him and RJ Harvey. RJ Harvey has done more on the field than Brooks. Um, but I don't want to take away from Brooks considering he's played one fewer game than all the other leaders. He's the only one who's actually missed a full game. Uh, Fourth in the conference in rushing yards. His average is 5.4, which is one of the lower end ones. Third in touchdowns with 8. He's just so consistent, as you mentioned, and he's such an important and vital piece to Texas Tech's offense. It's but kind of like RJ Harvey and kind of like um, Micah Bernard and Devin Neal to some extent, despite how good he is and important he is, like even when he has a really good and impactful game, it's not necessarily always showing up in the win-loss column. Like, and so like that's why I have to put him third. I love Taj Brooks. He's so much fun and he's a fun running back to watch and to cover. But he's just like the game that's been missed, I got to ding him a little bit for. Um, the average yards per carry, I got to ding him a little bit for. So like I would love to have him higher, but and I will say this, the difference between him and RJ Harvey and Michael Bernard and Devin Neal to me, like there's two guys who have separated themselves to me, and everyone else, there's a nice tight grouping of these are just really, really good backs. They're really fun to watch. They make such a big impact for their team, but they don't have the impact that the top two guys are. So we agree on Taj Brooks number 3. He is a ton of fun to watch. He's been a ton of, I know Texas Tech fans love him, and he's going to set some records at Texas Tech once he's done some career records for
yeah.
the Red Raiders once he finishes.
Yeah, definitely. In fact, his coach even came out and said in the offseason that he's like 1,100 yards away from the all-time rushing record, and they intended to break it this season. And sort of just to add a little bit more on Brooks, yeah, he missed one game, and he's second in the conference currently in carries. So that's sort of a testament to how much volume he gets, right? Like he gets so many touches per game that even though he missed one, he's still only behind Cam Scatterbo in carries currently. Okay, so I guess that brings me to my number two selection here in the top five. And spoiler alert, yeah. So the last two names here are RJ Harvey and Cam Scatterbo. It's just a question of where to rank them. For me, I'm putting Harvey at number two. And, again, maybe I sound like a broken record here. This whole top five, splitting hairs. These guys are very, very close, all of them, because they've all had pretty good seasons, really good seasons, actually. RJ Harvey, he was extremely productive early on in the season, and there was sort of a two-game stretch where he was still good, and then he had a great game this past weekend against Iowa State. That game against Iowa State really sort of opened my eyes about him because Iowa State has a pretty good defense. They had good defensive numbers coming into that game. So I was sort of interested to see, RJ Harvey, especially with a new QB in there, him being the focal point of the defense. How would he do against a pretty stout defense? He did quite well. It feels like RJ Harvey has been in college football forever. Like, he's been around since like 2018 or something. He's just been bouncing around. Started off, I think, somewhere, it might have been Maryland or some other team, then transferred. So it feels like he's been around for forever. And I think he even has another year of eligibility, if I'm not mistaken. Um, yeah, I mean the difference, and you kind of alluded to it when you were covering him earlier, is UCF as a program, the individual success for Harvey hasn't translated as much to team success. Cam Scatterbo, not that Arizona State's undefeated or anything, but I think in the preseason, the expectations for the Big 12 for where Arizona State would line up in that hierarchy, I think they've overperformed. So even though they took a tough loss this past weekend, but in general, I'd say they're doing probably better than a lot of people expected. Scatterbo is just that entire offense, right? I mean, he does a lot of different things for them. He's receiving, he's rushing, he'll even throw a touchdown pass here and there. So he is so involved in that offense that he really does everything. Much like Harvey, Harvey does a lot for that offense as well. He doesn't throw any touchdown passes the way Scatterbo has in his career, but look, we're nitpicking on that one. So. But Harvey is having a fantastic year. If I'm not mistaken, he is leading the Big 12 in rushing yardage right now. So the production certainly is there, and Harvey's been great as we expected in the offseason. But for me, I'm going to put him at number two. And I guess I spoiled it, but yeah, Scatterbo is my number one.
Well, I've got Scatterbo at two, and spoiler, I have DJ Giddens at one. And I have gone back and forth on this a lot. Listen to the Ten12 podcast. Like I go back and forth here on the difference of, I think at this point, Giddens is the best back in the Big 12. I think Scatterbo is the most important back to his team's success in the Big 12. I get it. They lost this week and Scatterbo was limited against Cincinnati, but like you switch to a different quarterback and they were able to key in on Scatterbo and limit him to some extent. But it's a debate between most important versus best. And if I'm going to sit here and do best, I go back and forth. From a talent standpoint, thanks for the nice advertisement there. I go at this point, and again, I've gone back and forth. I've got Scatterbo 2 and DJ Giddens 1. Giddens has been incredible. He's been awesome for Kansas State. He has made some huge plays for them, and his stats are fantastic. But he is not as important to the team's success as Scatterbo has been for Arizona State. Arizona State is not sitting here one win away from bowl eligibility without Cam Scatterbo being, I think, the workhorse back. And we talked about what Taj Brooks has done, right? And how important he has been and how reliable he has been for Texas Tech. I mean, we pull up the stats here and look at them. And I'm gonna pull them up again real quick. There it is. And look, you look at Scatterbo, it's 150 carries. It's the most in the conference. I get it. His average of 5.7 isn't as high as RJ Harvey's, isn't as high as DJ Giddens. 10 touchdowns, second most in the conference, 121 yards. I get it. He's had to do more, but he has to do more. He is so important to Arizona State. I just lean DJ Giddens as being the better back at this point. And so part of that is he's got an offense, I think, that has more talent. You've got a better quarterback right now in Avery Johnson. I think you have a better offensive line. And so I am going to go with more talented over more important at this point. But I just keep going back and forth, and it's so hard for me to determine between those two who is to me going to be at the end of the year RB1. But I think if you're going to look at first team when the season comes to an end, it's it's going to be an interesting debate when you put two running backs on the first team All Big 12 at the end of the year. Scatabo, DJ Giddens, RJ Harvey, to me, and Taj Brooks are the guys who, above all else, are going to be the four players that debate between there. If you've got Scatabo and RJ Harvey right now, if the season ended today, would those be your two first team All Big 12? Is that who you would predict to be on there? Is those two?
Yeah, well, predicting is yeah. So this is a different question, right? So
Yeah.
projecting forward, um, you know, it's tough to say. I'd have to sort of look at the schedules as well because the matchups will be quite impactful, I think, in the stats for some of these guys down the line. Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, Scatabo, I don't think it's going to change for him that he's always going to be the guy for Arizona State. He's just going to continue to get that usage, and the usage by itself is going to make his stats look pretty good. Obviously, he has to be a good player as well to do something with the touches. RJ Harvey, they have a new QB there, right? Ja'Carri Brown,
Mhm.
where I'm interested to see what happens with this offense because KJ Jefferson wasn't getting it done. Ja'Carri Brown, I'm excited about. He actually looked okay in his first start. So things could get pretty exciting there. Again, I'd have to look at their schedule. Um, with DJ Giddens, we're splitting hairs here. If I had to make a prediction, it's like, any of these three in particular, I would say are really right there. I mean, Taj Brooks for me at this point of the season for the initial question, just because he's so consistent. I just love consistency. I love stability. So I give him that sort of nod when I put him at three over Giddens. But if I had to make a prediction, I'm completely fine with saying Scatterbo and Harvey. But of course, DJ Giddens, Taj Brooks, it could be any two of those four, right?
Yeah, it feels like at some point, how the team performs is going to impact that a little bit, right? Like if Kansas State's in the Big 12 title game, you're
Yes.
probably going to see DJ Giddens get the nod. If Texas Tech finds their way there or is sitting one game out, then Taj Brooks might find himself with that opportunity. So I think team success is going to have an impact by the end of the year on that RB2 in all Big 12 alongside. I just don't know how you don't put Cam Scatabo in. I don't know. And maybe he's the one who gets left out. I don't know, but we will. It's a really fun, interesting. There's been a lot of fan bases who are really mad that their running back is not a first team All Big 12 and throwing whatever stat that player is leading in or beating the other guy in as to why they should have been in. It's going to be a fun debate. You mentioned a couple names. We'll wrap up on this. You mentioned Ollie Gordon. You mentioned Micah Bernard. Who is that first guy left out? Because you got with Devin Neal at number 5. Is Bernard the number 6 for you? Is he that guy who was just on the outside looking in?
Yeah, well, again, it sort of depends on there's three ways to look at it, right? I mean, in terms of just raw talent, my gut feeling, I still would like to say Ollie Gordon there. Honestly, I would like to have Ollie Gordon in my top five, but again, if we're basing it off of this year in a vacuum, it's very hard to make the argument for him over someone like Devin Neal just based on what has happened. But I see a game like last Friday versus BYU, and I saw what Ollie Gordon did, looked like himself from last year. And it sort of reminds you of the talent that he is. It's just been a bizarre sort of season for Oklahoma State. And then on the other sort of way I could look at it is, a guy like LJ Martin who just he's missed time, but when he's on the field is absolutely dynamite, right? And if you just take his 3 games and you projected that, now I know that's not a great argument, but just for the sake of hypotheticals, we look at his 3 games, just projected it out to 6 or 7 games for a full season. He'd be right up here in the discussion, right? Everybody would be talking about him in the top 5 also. And he's another guy who he's a good receiver, had a long touchdown catch a couple weeks ago. I really love his skill set. BYU is winning games right there at the top of the Big 12. So he's one where, like, the second half of the season, assuming he's healthy and this usage continues, he could be a shoe in here for top 5, and everybody's top 5 for Big 12 running backs by the end of the year because he might be the most productive team on the best records, best team in the Big 12. Um, and then Micah Bernard. Yeah, you mentioned it. So at this point in time, in terms of like what has happened production wise, looking at the stat sheet, Micah Bernard certainly he's right there. And probably if I had to sort of, yeah, make a top six, Bernard would probably have been my selection at the end of the day. A lot of the reasons why you sort of covered them. He's been sort of their consistent sort of anchor on that offense amidst a lot of turmoil. OC is obviously stepped down, quarterback injured, unfortunately. A lot of difficulties, lot of obstacles to overcome. Bernard's been, pretty consistent for them. He's sort of that player that they rely on when everything breaks down, and he's been productive, right? So he has the sort of numbers to match to back it up. And again, each of those three names, Ollie Gordon, L.J. Martin, and Micah Bernard, there's an argument that I can make for why each of them would be sort of that sixth guy out. But I think if I was choosing today, who would be my number six? It'd be Micah Bernard. But I am very interested to see what happens in the second half of the season, right? I mean, maybe Ollie Gordon is back. Maybe that starts to get going. He didn't even really start killing it last year until like week 4 or 5 or something like that. So we're not even that far off from last year. Things could get crazy here down the stretch.
Yeah, like it's hard to decide how much of the blame goes toward Ellie Gordon, right? And how much is on the offensive play calling and how much is on the offensive line. And I think it's a combination of the three, which makes sense. But I mean, you saw it against BYU. He's still an incredibly talented running back. I agree on LJ Martin. When he's out there, man, he is so impactful. He hasn't been able to be out there. And I mean, we haven't even talked about Corey Kiner, who I think has been a solid running back for Cincinnati. Like this is just, it remains an incredibly deep running back, a collection of running backs in the Big 12. I am not going to be shocked if they were all draft eligible or all going to the draft at the end of the season, if you saw 10, 11, 12 running backs out of the Big 12 all get drafted and then multiple other ones get a undrafted free agent opportunity. So, man, it's always a pleasure to have you on. I love talking about running backs with you. You do a great job, and Volume Pigs is such a fantastic subscription to have. Do me a favor, tell everybody about Volume Pigs. What is this Substack? What is this newsletter that you put out that you do such a great job with?
Oh, sure. And look, I appreciate the kind words. Always happy to come back on as long as you want to have me on. Love talking running backs as well. And oh, you even got the homepage up there. Perfect. So, Volume Pigs, yeah, it's a Substack. It's a newsletter that I write. As you can see, it's all about college football. There is a specific focus on college fantasy football. So, there's a lot of sort of stats and analysis about that specifically. But if you're just a college football fan, I think you'll also find utility with this newsletter, as I believe, Philip, you're not necessarily a CFF guy, but you're a college football fan. And as you mentioned, I think you're sort of enjoying your subscription as well. So, as you can see on the home screen, yeah, there's all kinds of different college football topics being discussed in this newsletter. So, if that seems of interest to you, feel free to give it a look.
I always think fantasy football is a unique way to look at things and having a fantasy football perspective. You've done, especially when you were talked about in the off season, like you did a really good job of highlighting different players that maybe weren't getting the attention. You had a great article. That's how I found Volume Pigs about running backs, about LJ Martin, which is how I stumbled upon you. And so really, really good content, folks. So if you just love college football and you want to take in more and look at different player analysis, especially from a fantasy football, so a production standpoint, go subscribe to Volume Pigs. It's great stuff. Justin, it's always a pleasure, man. I look forward to it. We gotta get you on to talk about more just running backs. We could talk about just Big 12 players as a whole, talk college fantasy. I played college fantasy football a few years ago. And if I didn't have three small children and a podcast and a full-time job, I would probably try and do it again. But I have to limit myself somewhere. I've got three dynasty NFL leagues to manage. I don't know if I can find so. Justin, again, thank you so much, man. It's a pleasure to get you on here. It's always fun to talk with you. You know your stuff. So we'll talk to you again soon.
Yeah, man. And like I said, always a pleasure coming on. Always happy to talk about running backs. We could talk about running backs forever, I feel like.
It's
Just
fun.
all day, right? So, but yeah, I'm happy to talk about anything Big 12 related. Anytime there's any topics you have in mind, feel free to hit me up. I love coming on the show.